Okay, in this video I wanted to spend some time going over Sinzhu, the guide writer for WoWhead's first impressions of the Brewmaster Monk going into Midnight. Now, obviously I want to preface that this is more of an opinionated piece. I personally am going to agree and also probably disagree with some points that are raised in this article, but I think Sinzhu does a really good job at capturing what's working and what isn't in essence for the Brewmaster Monk in alpha so far. Now, we are currently only in phase 3. There's still a handful of bugs. There's also some things that are currently not working all that great. So I'm hoping that I'm able to break it down, maybe add some context to specific elements, and I will be on alpha also showing you guys maybe if there's anything specific to talk about or showcase. So let's dive into it, and then I will also leave this article in the description below if you'd like to read through it yourself. So what's unique about the Brewmaster Changes is that how I personally feel is like going into 11.2 in the War Within, we had fairly significant changes to the class. Obviously, there's barring some issues still with, rotational bloat and complexity, but it felt like it was in a good spot and something that's considered, as what Sinzhu also mentions, somewhat meta. Brewmasters are doing really well this season, partly due to a combination of their tier set and their damage. The main stat scaling with their survivability also goes really well. Also, the dungeon design is just a little bit more favored to Brewmaster compared to other seasons. But it was surprising to see such a major rework or change going in to Midnight. So they break down the developer's notes here. Brewmaster's kit contains a number of very niche cooldown and abilities, as well as a number of talents, which have a highly transformative impact on gameplay. These can cause the specialization to be difficult to learn, especially in combination with developing intuition surrounding Stagger. We are aiming to broaden some of these niches while narrowing the impact of transformational talents. In addition, some abilities have been removed in order to better concentrate both power and gameplay focus on a more manageable core. Finally, many of the tooltips have been adjusted to improve clarity and their function. I generally disagree with this. I think the class still has not super great tooltips, but nonetheless, that is Blizzard's statement on the Brewmaster rework going into Midnight. So, as Sinzhu points out, basically, they're trying to simplify not only the rotation and consolidating certain effects, which we'll talk about in a bit, but also just making it easier to understand and manage Stagger, as well as things like Purifying Brew, which is the main way Brewmasters mitigate. So, at a basic level, Brewmaster isn't necessarily changing its design philosophy or its class identity. It's still, you're using mystical brews, as Sinzhu says, combining it with martial arts, with the more wacky elements of throwing barrels, and using some pyromaniac abilities for some reason, breathing fire and throwing tornadoes now, and engulfing yourself in flames. So all in all, the core kit is generally staying the same. So a big thing that people have gone over, myself included, is that we are no longer having access to Rising Sunkick. If we jump in-game and open up our talent tree, Rising Sunkick has been replaced with Stagger, specifically for the Brewmaster Monk. And something like Fast Feet now doesn't increase Rising Sun Kick's damage, but instead increases Blackout Kick's damage. This is essentially simplifying the class. It's simplifying your rotation. It's removing one of those not super impactful abilities. Rising Sun Kick always felt, despite being a powerful ability for a single hit, it always feels like a filler and has different conditional values based on if you're in CDs, outside of CDs, if you're trying to get some off healing in, and then based on some talents that they have gone ahead and removed. Now, one concern that Brewmaster players may have is that the rotation is feeling like it's going to get back to the point where you can unironically play the entire class, or I guess spec, with just a cast sequence macro. Mostly, this is mostly because, first off, we're an energy-based class, so we don't scale that well with haste in terms of allocating resources. And so when you have a non-haste class that's energy-based and has set abilities that have, this ability has a 5-second cooldown, this ability has a 6-second cooldown, this ability has a 3-second cooldown, they weave together in such a way that feels good to press, but can also be scripted in such a way where you can use a one-button macro that goes like that isn't the single button assist, and it's going to be actually pretty effective. So in terms of its damage rotation, Brewmaster is becoming easier to play, which I personally believe is a good thing. Now, as someone who mythic raids at a high end and does high keys, of course I personally want the class to be hard. It's satisfying to play. I want to be able to, showcase my ability to play the class in the game effectively because of, the time that I've spent building that muscle memory to play the class. But at the same time, I also want more people to be able to play the class that I enjoy so much because it is a fun class to play. So there is this weird duality. And of course, Sinzhu also plays at a very high end and has pointed this out. It is a knee-jerk negative reaction. I agree with this, but also allowing it to help newer brewmasters play also is good, So another big thing that is being changed going into Midnight is they are essentially stripping down the stagger mechanic. They are removing some of the layered elements of not only stagger, but also purifying brew and how it interacts with your kit alongside purified chi. So if we jump into alpha, so purifying brew will now purify a percentage of your stagger or a minimum amount of max health. This is going to be your primary way you're going to end up mitigating damage as a brewmaster, and that's fine. But the thing that they changed is that Celestial Brew, as well as its Celestial Infusion counterpart, will no longer increase based on the amount of recent purified damage. So this is something that was called Purified Chi from basically when they reworked Celestial Brew into the game back in Shadowlands. So now these abilities are just baseline. They're flat. You can go into a pull using it immediately. You can wait a little bit before using it, but essentially these abilities have been stripped down a little bit. And from my testing, it seems like it's like it always has it's like 2 to 3 purified chi stacks, I guess, in comparison. So it's trying to average it out. It's currently hard to get a pretty hard read on tuning, but it feels like Celestial Brew and Celestial Infusion are going to be a little less impactful, but that could be also due to having lower secondary stats from leveling. It could be due to tier set. It could be just due to tuning in general. They've also added certain things that allow us to heal more, like Vital Flame, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But essentially, they're making the stagger and the purifying brew mechanic a little bit easier to understand and no longer contingent on your stagger levels. They have also made a change where it will notify you when you're an elevated stagger, which is a new term that they're using, whenever there's a major spike in stagger. So this is going to help other players or new players understand when they should be hitting this button, even though it's still going to be a little bit of a skill curve because sometimes purifying immediately isn't always the best thing to do. But again, that may change because we have new additional talents like the reworked high tolerance, where purifying brew is now going to get refunded based on if you cast it in elevated stagger. A major concern currently as well is that the in-game user interface doesn't relay accurate stagger information to you. There's a lot of guys here with umbrellas. It's sunny out, guys. Or do people use umbrellas in the sun? I feel like that's some real rich people shit, man. Or I guess if you're just don't want to use sunscreen and are nervous about. Okay, anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. I don't even remember what I was talking about. Oh yeah, stagger. So what I'm trying to show, I guess, is if we go into gameplay enhancements, we go to cooldown manager, we enable this, we go to the buff bars, and then we go, can I search stagger? I can put my stagger tracking in here, right? But the issue with this, and maybe there's a way, man, this is why I wish Blizzard would allow use of personal weak cores and stuff, because you can make an argument that tracking your actual exact stagger level percentage-wise or even numerically is really important. But as I take damage here, it's going to show that I'm in light stagger, but what level of light stagger? And of course, I can always look down here, which is also nice. I can see that I'm at, 47k. You can kind of glance at the full bar. But the problem is, what happens when, especially in high content, what happens when you're well above your entire health threshold? You're at 150% stagger, you're at 200% stagger. Sometimes this information's important for players to optimize their ability to self-heal or knowing when they need to purify exactly. Because sometimes if you're at 200% stagger but you're at full health, sometimes you don't need to purify right away. And so with them not having an adequate way to track stagger in game, this is a major concern for some players like Sinzhu or other high players who are just concerned that they need to know. So the visual cap is 100%, but the real cap is 10 times your health threshold. And like they pointed out, you regularly exceed 200. There are pulls and dungeons when I'm reviewing footage on live where I am hitting 350% stagger in some cases, where there's a lot of auto attacks or a big tank buster that happens at the right time, and I'm also using additional tools and defenses where you're going to exceed well above this. So Blizzard definitely needs to make some adjustments to stagger tracking in the base game, and not just say light, moderate, heavy, but give us a number, allow us to track something like that. So they also talk about cooldowns being gone. Now, it's weird because we have lost both Dampen Harm and Diffuse Magic and Weapons of Order. Of course, we also lost Zenmed, which I'm okay with Zenmed being gone. Zenmed was super clunky. So the only thing that we have access to defensively is going to be Fortifying Brew. You can expand on this talent by playing its like extension, Iron Shell Brew or Fortification. You can also play into talents like Determination in the class tree, even though this has notoriously not been super great, and it's also not very clear how it exactly affects Stagger because the numbers change based on diminishing returns. But nonetheless, this is really our only defensive in our kit. Weapons of Order being gone is weird because the tooltip for Shado-pan still states that casting Weapons of Order calls upon a Shado-pan fighter. We don't know if this is being reworked specifically for Brewmaster yet, or if they're going to try to tie it to Niuzao, the Black Ox, or if they're going to reintroduce Weapons of Order as a baseline ability, or if they're going to rework it to something else like Exploding Keg, or I don't really know what else they can really work it to, but basically, we're not sure if this has been fully removed yet, or it's been kind of stripped out and then it's not yet implemented again. So we have lost a lot of defensives, which I don't think is a bad thing. I think Stagger is powerful enough. It's just Fortifying Brew still feels kind of meh, you know? Like Fortifying Brew is kind of a bad cooldown. Of course, we still have things like Slushy Brew and Infusion, which can act as like another form of DR. But the alternatives that we got for those defensives are all passive. So we have Dance with the Wind, so now we just have an increased dodge chance. And despite, I think, common opinion, Yu'lon's Grace isn't bad. Now, it used to be a lot more powerful back when it was 2% instead of 1%, stacking up to 20% instead of 10%. But in terms of pure magic mitigation, or I guess overall healing, this ends up not being a terrible choice. But Diffuse Magic was better for players who are more in tune with the damage profile of a fight, of a specific encounter, of a dungeon, of how it can reflect damage. We can still reflect damage with the newly reworked Diffuse Magic, which ties it into Fortifying Brew. But again, we still need to see what encounters look like. It's no longer a magic DR, it's just a reflection of any kind of dots. And Blizzard's been really weird lately about Diffuse Magic. I believe in Season 1 and Season 2 of The War Within, there was almost no uses for Diffuse Magic. So I'm curious to see if there's actually more uses going forward and this becomes an applicable talent choice. And so, of course, there's major concerns with a lot of these things being removed. Call to Arms is no longer in play, so no more mini cow windows. We no longer have Chi Surge. So the only thing that we're left with offensively is Exploding Keg and the Black Ox. The weird thing about the Black Ox, though, is depending on tuning with Apex talents and, of course, some of these other talent tuning, there's a world where we don't even play into Niuzao. Because a lot of the power of the Black Ox was chugging Purifying Brews and, of course, getting to walk with the Ox. But because Walk with the Ox is still in the center of the tree, you technically don't need to play the Black Ox anymore, which means you can opt out of one of these offensive cooldowns, which is just kind of awkward. So yeah, the class has definitely been stripped down in complexity, not only from Stagger, but also being able to manage your defensives, which is, again, going to be very good for a lot of players, but also a little bit more awkward. Moving on to kind of the next part. If you want to read this article, Sinzhu does a good job at laying out all of the new talents in a dropdown, removed talents, as well as revised talents. So this is all good stuff. I'm not going to go through every little bit here. So theme, consistency. Despite receiving significant talent changes in the War Within, Brewmasters have nonetheless seen a lot of additional adjustments. So this is something that I pointed out at the start, but this is kind of, I would say, more or less unexpected now. We knew that Blizzard was kind of going in this direction with making classes more simple, but this feels like a true rework to the class, which is interesting. So we've seen a removal of things like Purified Chi, Hit Scheme, Stagger scaling interactions have been changed as well. They also have made it so even things like Dragonfire Brew no longer is based on your level of Stagger, which simplifies the class a little bit more and ideally will make the class easier to tune, especially with certain talent points. Notably, they've also made Blackout combo a little bit easier to understand. A common complaint I hear from a couple of Brewmaster players is that they're making the class too easy. I don't mind Blackout combo being reworked to be a little bit more simple, because before it was affecting Breath of Fire, it was affecting Celestial Brew, it was also actually more like it was being affected by Purifying Brew, because Purifying Brew is off the global cooldown, it was very easy to accidentally eat this proc before benefiting from the damage, and the Purifying Brew bonus was almost in 99.99% of cases so bad. There were a few times where it could be useful, but most players never actually could optimize that. And so the Breath of Fire was also weird because regardless, if you applied it with an empowered blackout combo, your Breath of Fire extra DR, and of course you were getting extra damage from it too, but if you recast a Breath of Fire later, mostly because of things like South Salabim strength, it would then overlap and knock the 10% DR back down to 5, and that's obviously a frustrating interaction with the talent. And the Celestial Brew / Celestial Infusion bonus, very, very niche, getting the extra Purified Chi stacks, because it wouldn't make it go above 6. So if you were at 6 and then you Blackout Kick into a Celestial Brew, it would still just be a 6-stack Celestial Brew. But if you were at 1 stack and then you Blackout Kick into a Celestial Brew, it was a 4-stack. This was really good on certain fights, like any kind of boss with like a heavy hitting tank buster where you might have not had enough time to accumulate high amount of Purified Chi stacks, but you needed a maximum shield to live. I think Nexus King Saladar from the War Within raid, Mana Forge Omega, is a great example of when this could be useful. But again, it's so niche, it's so specific, and they just removing all 3 of those kind of awkward, clunky interactions, I think it's just going to be better for everyone. They're making everything feel more consistent, which hence the little thing here, theme consistency. So very good. And lastly, they did point out we are keeping some of the more well-received new talents in going into Midnight. One of, I think, the most highly anticipated things about the Brewmaster coming in Midnight is the fire-esque abilities. So things like your Rushing Jade Wind and your special delivery being fire damage, as well as Exploding Keg having capstones, which enhance on the ability doing more fire damage. So if we come in game, and I've showcased this before, but now when you're playing something like Celestial Flame, drinking a brew has the chance to turn your Rushing Jade Wind into fire damage. Similarly, special delivery will also deal additional damage as fire. It's not as flashy. I can't really tell if there's like an animation for it when I'm personally using it. But if I sit here and I hopefully pop some brews and pop it, you can see that my Rushing Jade Wind has turned into this fire tornado around my character instead, which is pretty cool. And it updates dynamically. So if you are in the middle of a Rushing Jade Wind and you pop a brew and it'll turn into fire immediately. And once your Celestial Flame ends, it'll turn back into Rushing Jade Wind. So that's kind of nice. But the big thing that I think people are excited for, myself included, is after you throw Exploding Keg, your Keg Smashes spawn these fire tornadoes, which is so sick. It also gives you a bunch of damage. Also, this alpha build has been so laggy. It's actually insane. Like, I can't actually test anything. So, yeah, big fire tornadoes. Very fun, very cool, very thematic. Unfortunately, it's under-delivering in some elements where it's like a nice burst of damage and it's nice thematically, but I feel like doesn't really enhance your kit at all. So there's still a gripe about Exploding Keg being a 1-minute cooldown that does a little bit of AoE damage, but there's nothing else after it. I feel personally attacked here because Sinzhu calls out there's plenty of Brewmasters who are still under the impression that dealing multiple hits with Spinning Crane Kick to trigger the damage effect rather than other abilities is worthwhile. I think there's conditions where Spinning Crane Kick with an Exploding Keg in a large enough pool will deal more damage than whatever your next global is. But yes, Spinning Crane Kick in like single target or even 4 targets or whatever, if there's a condition where another ability is better, there's obviously you should be hitting that other ability. But Spinning Crane Kick, I think it does still deal a lot of damage, but in the context of niche scenarios in Mythic Plus or high target counts. But the problem is that Exploding Keg, especially playing Fuel by the Fire, is now going to reward you for Keg Smashing instead. And so there's just like, you have 20 seconds to use the buff, but you kind of want that burst of damage in certain scenarios. So it almost works against each other in a way. So yeah, I definitely though agree generally that most of the time. So since he does point out, despite being a damage loss in almost every scenario, like I said, like there are niche scenarios where it will do more damage. But yeah, like in single target, you shouldn't be Spinning Crane Kick. You should be relying on, an active Rushing Jade Wind, but then you're going to be able to get burst damage with these new talents. There's obviously some criticism coming out here from Sinzhu about the capstones, and I generally agree with this. The capstones to Exploding Keg don't feel all that impactful. Having Keg Smash being reset isn't all that important, especially with our current energy economy. And then on top of that, things like Empty the Cellar also don't feel that impactful. So if I apply these changes here, I can quickly I've talked about this in multiple videos already, but basically Empty the Cellar throws additional kegs. There's minimal CDR involved here. as well as you have to reactivate the ability. And there's a bug where it's prioritizing mobs that you're not in combat with, which obviously has some issues in itself. But if I throw an exploding keg here and then I can reactivate the ability, it's going to start chucking extra kegs out, dealing damage, which is nice and thematic, but doesn't feel all that impactful. And so Sinzhu brings up old abilities like Bone Dust Brew. I miss Bone Dust Brew so much. I thought it was such a fun ability because you would throw it down and then it would have your abilities have a chance to basically deal damage again, damage and healing at like a lower level of effectiveness, but it was like super kind of nice, a little RNG, but it was kind of nice to have. So I think they could maybe involve Bone Dust Brew, and they could reword it. It doesn't have to be Bone Dust Brew. They could rename it to be something else. But I do think the capstones are currently, with current tuning, looking a little underwhelming. And finally, love this Elder Scroll Online giant ad. And no, I'm not turning on an ad blocker. So the last criticism is that our Celestial feels not impactful again. Despite them working really hard to make it better, the Black Ox just doesn't feel like a core part of our kit. Being this deep in the tree makes it difficult to grab, plus the way that it doesn't have any impact with the rest of our tree makes it feel awkward. It is worth noting that the additional capstone node, Heart of the Ox, the 5% mastery, feels stronger than having the Black Ox itself, because you're going to gain 5% mastery, which is 5% attack power, while just permanently. And then it's doubled while the Black Ox is active. There's still criticism about Mighty Stomp, which I'm not even going to get into here. This is the major concern that we have is like Brewmasters, and more broadly speaking, monks are supposed to be tied heavily to their celestial being, whether it's obviously like Chi-Ji or Yulan for Mistweavers, Zuen for your Windwalkers, which are powerful cooldowns in themselves. And then you have Niuzao, which just has, in season 3 of the War Within, it's felt good, but as a damage CD, and it also leads to some degenerate behavior. But there's no real power behind the pet, and also it's a pet, so it's like awkward in some situations where it's like has weird pathing or it's out of position, especially if you are playing Mighty Stomp and it's not hitting all the mobs or CCing everything. So it's an ability that I really think they should bake into the kit, not make it baseline, but have it more centralized. Also have it be more powerful than it currently is. Make it kind of the core staple of our class. And again, it's early alpha. They might be doing it with Wisdom of the Wall for Shado-pan specifically. Time will tell, but it's still in like a weird state. And then last but not least, we are going to talk about Apex talents really quickly. The Apex talents, I think, are really good. They're really cool. I think for Brewmaster, though, they're very boring. It's all passive, right? So you're going to be rewarded for drinking your brews. It's a 20% chance per brew you drink to leave you with an empty barrel. What that looks like is it turns your keg smash into this like little like keg looking thing. And then when you throw it, it's going to lob an additional keg. Now the additional Apex points build on this by increasing the physical damage you deal by up to 10%. And empty barrels will now ricochet up to hitting up to 4 targets total. So the first point you spend here will hit 2 targets, and then when you spend 2 points, it hits 4 targets. And it's going to like have a chain lightning-esque effect where it's going to do reduced damage for each target it hits. Is it cool thematically? Of course. You're throwing your keg, you're throwing additional kegs on top of your keg, and it's kind of bouncing around, ricocheting. It's a fun-looking spell, but it's not that impactful. It's completely passive. And outside of like a string of good luck, which I think Sinzhu kind of talks about in here, outside of kind of having good RNG, more often than not, it's just not super thematic. And then to get to the most powerful ability, which is the Refreshing Drink, you have to spend 4 points, which feels like a lot. And this is, all Apex talents have the same design philosophy. Good power spike for the first point. You're spending 2 points to kind of like, you're kind of sacking 2 points to get a little bit of extra power, but they're probably better spent elsewhere. But then the capstone's really strong. But depending on the encounter and the type of content you're doing, you might want to spend all 4 points here, which diminishes how many points and how much power you're going to get from your actual tree, which also kind of feels a little bad. Now, currently, Refreshing Drink with current tuning feels a little too strong. It's healing the Brewmaster and 2 additional players for quite a bit. And again, with good luck and good RNG, you can proc a ton of these doing a ton of group healing in certain encounters. Obviously, this is speculation. So the Apex talents, it's like cool, it's thematic, but it's also a little RNG and kind of boring. And moving down kind of into the final thoughts. The Midnight iteration of the Brewmaster Monk feels like the same old specialization with a new sip of spirits. I love the play on words. That's good. Roughly half of its ideas involving consistency and improving the learning experience we've already added to its Don't Call It a Rework patch of 11.2. And honestly, it has. Yes, I totally agree. I think there has been a great level of perception in terms of positivity for Brewmaster players or people who are finding the class for the first time or actually finally giving it a shot. It's been a little bit more rewarding and a little bit easier to understand in the 11.2 patch, and now it's going to become a little bit more, a little bit easier to play going into Alpha or Midnight. Basically, Sinzhu's conclusion is the class is becoming a little bit more flashy through things like Celestial Flame, and it's becoming a little bit more simple with the removal of a lot of our major cooldowns, including the Zen med removal in the War Within Season 3, along with Diffuse, Dampen, and Weapons of Order. The class is going to be very fun to play personally. It's obviously still early alpha, which I've said several times. The class does look pretty simple. I have way more keybind. I keep having this question. People are like, is this all you have to do to play Brute? No, I have like a whole extra bar down here with a bunch of like extra stuff that you cannot see, like Crackling Jade Lightning, Spinning Crane Kick, my Touch of Death is down here, Roll, Tiger's Lust, Ring of Peace, I guess is on my bar, Paralysis. You know, you have a lot more buttons in your kit. I just like to do this when I'm leveling, so I have like a simplified view of what I could play with. But basically, class is going to be very fun, but we still don't know what it means for its overall power level. Anyways, that is my overall reaction to Sinzhu's article. Again, I'm going to leave this down below, and of course, it was very well written, and I think points out some of the major flaws with the current state of Brewmaster on Alpha. So let me know what you guys think. Let me know if you have any questions about the class. As the changes and new phases keep getting pushed, I'm going to hopefully keep updating you guys on those changes. But yeah, GG Sinzhu, and thanks for writing this all out. So anyways, hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.